Welcome back. I'm going to critique this awesome submission by Snow. Follow and DM me on Twitter if you want to appear in a critique episode. Okay, so first of all, this looks amazing. It's pretty awesome. I love the depth that there is, the lighting, it's pretty great. So it might be a little tough to critique this, but we're gonna give it a shot. So something that I noticed is that it's kind of dark here. And I don't even know how you did all this here. That's amazing. But I think something I can point out is the shading on the antlers and this skull face here. So first thing I notice is that you have sort of like bright areas like this right here where the arrow is, and maybe a little bit of reflection here in the water, which is fantastic. However, this skull, it looks too bright to look kind of natural. It looks almost like there's a light shining on it. The shading is great, but what I would do is probably make it a little bit darker. Actually, let me duplicate that layer. If you're interested in using this software, it's called Aseprite. There's a link in the description. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but I get a tiny little kickback. So there's a lot of colors here for shading, and it's great because it makes it look realistic, but I prefer to sort of have fewer colors. Oh, it looks like I need to shrink down your art piece as well, since my pixels are a lot bigger. I think we can go to sprite size, and then let's decrease this by 50%. And now our pixels are going to be the right size. When you send me artwork, just send it to me at the original file format. So I love this preview here that we have, but I think I want to lock it. And there's a button right here, I think it's the first one, that locks that preview in. So that way we can tweak this, but it's always good to zoom out to see what your artwork looks like. But I mean, if you got a preview, you don't need to be zooming out. So something I'm going to do is lighten up some of these dark areas. This right here is green, and I'm not actually sure why it's green. So I'm also going to make this kind of like the bone color. And I'm going to just pick a couple. So it looks like we have this one, and this one's a little bit darker. And I'm mostly going to stick to these two. Oh wait, was that a different color? Yeah, so it looks like we have three here, as you can see. This one, and this one. So maybe these three I'm gonna just try to stick to. This part right here is a hole, so it's black. However, we can shade around it to kind of make it look more like it has an indent. So that way the contrast here isn't so harsh. And actually, I think that this entire color needs to be darker. So something I'm going to do is I'm going to select that color. I'm going to go a little bit darker. A great way to actually get a color is I'm going to grab this one here, lower the opacity, and get this like sort of like in between color. And now this one is what I want the rest of this to be. So let's get the paint bucket tool. Let me see. The paint bucket's a drop in Aseprite. It always throws me off. And then I'm going to color in this skull here, and this is what I was talking about, where, as you can see, to me personally, it looks kind of bright. To me, it seems like it would be a little bit darker, because if you look at the trees and stuff, unless there's like a ray of light, which would be kind of a cool thing to add to this, a ray of light shining on the character, I think the color of this skull would be darker. But you see how only this area got darker, but the other parts that use that same color didn't. If we uncheck contiguous here, now that color gets updated everywhere in our composition. And I think that's fantastic. This now has a really high contrast, a higher contrast than before, but whatever. I think I'll leave that. The reflection there is actually pretty cool. I might even use that in some other areas. In some other areas, like maybe here near the eye. And maybe even somewhere like here near this hole on the nose. The reason why I'm putting it near the eye here is because that's where there would be sort of like a bend, and since there's a bend there'd be an opportunity for light to reflect. And I think maybe even a little bit over here. I'm skipping. The reason why I didn't put a line there and why I'm skipping a line is because it makes it look like it's not smooth, and since this is bone and it's not smooth, we don't want it to have a perfectly smooth shading or highlight, because we want it to look a little bit rougher. So there's green here in this eye again, but I don't think that's necessary. So I'm gonna take this brown. I don't really get why there's green in that, because it looks like the cloak is green. You should join the community and share your pixel art in our Discord. You can also submit a character for Downhole, a mobile game I'm making. And the cloak, I think, has a ton of colors here, which is okay, but it will make it harder to animate. And I actually don't think the contrast in the cloak is high enough. Because the background is also green, you're gonna have to have a pretty big contrast like this here to differentiate, but there's gonna be areas where the contrast might not be as high. I'm going to grab this dark green here. This looks like one of the darkest greens you have. I like how it's hue shifted to blue here. Look, if we click this, look at the bottom left here. We can see it's a little bit blue. See, this is green and this is blue. They almost look the same, but I like this blue hue shift because a lot of times when there's a lack of color, like for example, nighttime, it's good to make grass a tint of blue or something like that, just because it looks a little bit cooler. And then if you want something to look a little bit warmer, you would hue shift a little bit more towards reds. So I'm going to take that really dark color and I'm going to put it here near the edge of this hood. And the reason why I'm putting it near the edge of this hood is to better establish almost like an outline. So we're not using the color black. However, I do still think we should use a very dark color near the edge here to establish a very strong outline that differentiates between these two. And unless the hood is tight on the head, you would have quite a bit more shading here around the top of the hood. You see what I'm doing there? It starts looking more like there's a bit of a gap, a little bit of space there on that hood, and I think that looks great. It looks like there's a little unevenness here with the shading around the edges. I'm not sure what you were going for with there, but I would also try not to have these sort of like right angles when you're doing outlines. So I'm going to take this green and I'm going to try to smooth that out a little bit more. I think the contrast between these two is too high. So I just think that you want to smooth a couple of things a little bit more. Those jagged kind of things are fine for, I don't know, something like this tree bark here where it has a natural look. But for something like the edge of a hood, etc., I get that there would be some wrinkles in there, so you want a little bit of inconsistency, but it's more important to emphasize kind of the shape of it, I think, than trying to make it look natural in this case. Like for example, you don't want to have too many like lines like this all over this skull, because it might look cool. It actually does. It actually does look cool. It might look cool, but it starts losing form, you know? It starts losing the shape of it. Whereas if we shaded it with a lot more thought in mind, for example, I'm just giving an example here. We don't have to do this, but if I shaded this entire section here, all of a sudden the skull now has a lot more form. Like these like cheeks right here, often this is a great part to shade for skulls or characters or anything. And I actually might even leave it like that. And I think some shading here near the bottom would be great too. And now since I did shade that part of the skull, I think we would actually need a darker color here around the nose part. Let me see, maybe a little bit more shading around this like eye socket or whatever. Maybe even a little bit darker here around the eye socket. I think that makes it look more like it's indented into the head. And then this part here is kind of too dark, and there's no kind of like transition. I think that the contrast is too high, so we want to kind of like smooth this a little bit just so it doesn't look like a hole. The smoother it is here, the less it'll look like there's a giant I don't know, gash in the head or something like that. You have green here on this skull, and I don't know if that was supposed to be like a little bit of like green gunk from the environment or whatever. If you want to do that, I think these colors are great. You want to have an in-between color. So a great way to do that is to take one of these greens and then lower the opacity, and now you have this sort of in-between, which looks a little bit more natural. So if we wanted to have, I don't know, kind of like a little bit of moss on this or whatever, to make it look like there's a little bit of debris or, you know, whatever. I think that's how you want to do it. You don't want to go with that dark green. you would actually want to go with that, with this in between, this lighter green. It's a little bit hard to tell what the arms are doing because it's so messy. There's a couple of ways we could do that. We could strengthen the outline. So for example, you could go with, I'm gonna make a new layer for this. You could go with black and then have a, you see how there's like a bunch of jaggeds here? Something that you can do is click Pixel Perfect, and that'll get rid of those jagged lines. So we could have, I can't even tell where the arm is honestly, but we could have a darker outline here near the bottom to help differentiate those two. But I can tell you're not going for outline. So another way to do it would be to emphasize the highlight here. So this area up here would be more highlighted to differentiate between those two parts. And actually, I think this needs to be a little bit, if we are using a highlight here, this needs to be a little bit smoothed out. But now the arm looks a little bit rounder, and it's a little bit more obvious where you have that arm. I love the reflections here in the water. I'm not sure why they're only around the player. I would probably add a couple of more around this area here. It'll look a little more consistent. That one totally looked bad, but there. So I would add a little bit more of those. I like that. A little bit more of those color highlights around there. For these, I'm assuming they're like fireflies or whatever. A cool effect that you can kind of do if you want to make something look a little bit more like it's sparkling is you have a couple of lines kind of like go left and right, you know, like make a little cross. It's kind of like this thing that happens when lights hit our eyes. We see these beams of light go across, and I would probably go and grab the eraser tool and then lower the eraser tool here, so that way we can fade it out a little bit. And let me just do this real quick, and now it kind of looks like that lighting is fading out. So you see if I zoom out now, it looks a little bit more like a sparkle. The contrast there didn't match very well, but okay, so something like that. Now maybe just a couple of them, you don't have to do it to all of them, maybe just a couple of them could have that, and then it'll look a little bit more sparkly. I'm one of the developers that worked on Dwerve. It's a tower defense dungeon crawler RPG. There's a link in the description. They also all look a very similar size. I think something you should do is have a couple of them that are tiny, you know, a couple of them that are like that small, and it'll give it more of a sense of depth. Like some of them are further back. And then with the antlers here, it doesn't look like they're even connected in some parts. I don't get why there's like gaps in this, but definitely fill that in. And then the antlers are also too light. There is shading here with the antlers, which is fantastic. But I think for the antlers, you would actually want these to be pretty dark in this case, because the antlers wouldn't be very reflective. So when you're doing lighting and you have a dark scene, you have to have there's going to be a much higher contrast between things that are and aren't lit up, because you have to think of reflection. During daytime, everything has a pretty decent amount of like saturation, but at night, objects that would have more color would be actually objects that are more reflective because they're taking in more light. So something like these antlers here, I would probably go with a darker color for these just in general. And I see that you have shading on one side, but to make things look rounder, I would add that shading on both sides like this. It can just be heavier on one side, but I think you should have that shading on both. So you can see this antler now, this part right here, it has a lot more form. And then if we added a highlight in this on that side, it would look extra round. But to make it look a little bit more natural, I don't think that the highlights should be consistent. Maybe just have them a little bit here and there, and especially near the bottom here. Another way that you can make it look like there's lighting coming in from the top is by not having highlights down here, which is what you were doing. So if we don't have highlights down here, and even if we make this whole section kind of darker, then we leave the highlights for the upper part, it actually looks pretty good because it makes it look like the lighting is coming from above, and that there are parts that wouldn't get lighting. So for example, this area here probably wouldn't get lighting, and it looks like you have light coming in from the right side over here. So it makes sense to highlight this antler. It makes sense to highlight the right side here. and not the left side. And then you know, you can do that a little bit more consistently throughout. I have that on another layer, so whatever. I mean, you get the point. I'm not gonna go and tweak it and finish it up. I think that the rest of this is actually pretty darn good, and I love that there's this high contrast here to differentiate between the background. That was very clever. For the head though, you don't have it there as much, but I wanted to point out just some really good things that I noticed about the way this artwork is done. Down here, this area is darker than this area here. I love that. So this green here is definitely not as bright as this, and that's awesome because it's getting less lighting. A great way to design your characters is to make their lower half a darker color of their upper half. It'll differentiate between the torso and the whatever and the legs, but also it brings people's attention to points of interest. So by making this part of the body darker down here, it draws a person's eye closer to the face. And then of course this bow here, because it's so bright and because the contrast is so high, it draws people's attention there. So you got to think about where people's attention is drawn. So people are going to be drawn to the high contrast here and here, and then they're going to be pulled towards the face and towards the bow. So this kind of has like 2 points of interest. I love that the antlers, like they're there, but you don't want to have the highlight in them be too strong, because if we, for example, had a really bright highlight here in the antlers, like they were golden or something, then what it would do is it would start drawing the person's attention to these antlers. And you don't need to give every single piece of your art a lot of detail. A great technique is to put detail into where you're drawing the person's eye. So for example, if you're not trying to draw the person's eye to the background, it doesn't need to have a lot of detail. So since people are going to be drawn to the bow here, I think it's important to make sure that these hands are clear, because, sorry, I had a burp, because people are going to notice that. But if there's like not a lot of detail here, people aren't gonna care. People are gonna care if there's detail and attention to form and stuff where their eyes are drawn. So the most important parts really are the face here and this part of the bow. And this part of the bow, I think, needs work. And a big reason for that is because the color of this arm and this bow is too similar. I don't think that's good color theory. So something that I would do is I like to keep similar colors in a canvas. Like for example, it would not be good to make this bow purple. Purple just wouldn't fit here. It would ruin all the, it would ruin the color theory there. So let's I'm gonna do this just for fun, just so you guys can see how odd it would look. So if we had a bow, if this bow here was purple, it actually doesn't look too bad because purple and yellow go well together. A worse color would be, I don't know, maybe like I don't know, something else. But anyway, since there's a little bit of blue here in the water, the color of the bow that I think would fit this composition without adding a new color would be the blue from that water. So I grabbed the blue from that water and I'm just putting it here on your bow, and now it still fits the composition, but because we use this this blue color, it differentiates it from better differentiates it from the character. It makes it look more like a separate object. That is not how I would necessarily shade the bow. I'm just trying to show you that you need to make objects different colors to separate them. So now this arm is definitely obvious where the arm and where the bow are. So there's a bunch of little areas where I think this artwork could be touched up. For example, there could be a little bit more shading here under the head, especially if the skull's sticking out. You know, it would probably have a bit more of a shadow under the head there. That would need to be blended a little bit better, etc. But I think that I think I gave you the majority of the takeaways here to push this artwork a little bit further. If you want to check out more critiques, I made a playlist for them. Thank you for this awesome submission, and remember, you can send me your artwork if you follow and DM me on Twitter. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Devlive.